For those of you who are joining this webinar, I mean, firstly, welcome. We'll just give it one more minute for slow connectors, slow connections to get people onto Zoom. So we'll start in a minute's time. And I can see the numbers ticking up slowly, so that's great for those of you who've logged on. Great. Well, good afternoon, and make it 1 minute past 2. So we will make a start. People are still joining, but that's absolutely fine. So welcome to the Institute of Economic Development's session on how are economic development professionals preparing for life beyond the 31st of December. So inevitably the Brexit question, and today we're joined by corporate members of the IED, focus consultants, and Heather Frecklington's representing them, and also GHD and Steve Scott's representing them, and then a fellow board member, Paul Frainer. But I'll let Heather, Steve and Paul introduce themselves in a moment. I'm Nigel Wilcock. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Development. And I just thought to kick this off, and hopefully not too depressingly, because I fear I am slightly depressed about this subject, but others on the panel may not be. I thought I'd maybe say a few words about where I think we are. For those of you who were at our conference last year, Will Hutton actually called this the largest single act of self-inflicted economic damage that any country had ever done to itself. So he certainly kicked our conference off with an optimistic note. And I do think that maybe the weight and maybe COVID has resulted in a bit of economic complacency about what's coming down the track. We're beginning to hear about concerns about short-term disruption, and we'll have to see how true they are. But you know, I personally want to look a bit beyond that. I personally think next year we might see a bit of a false dawn. I think we might see some economic reshoring as a result of COVID. I think we might see some attempts to reduce supply chain complexity, and that might bring some things back on shore. But I don't think that's going to be the end result. I think that sunk investments that manufacturers have made, etc., and sort of means that they'll remain here for a while, but there'll just be this slow and gradual realignment to a new competitive environment, and that does, I think, raise points of concern. I think it means that as time goes on, inevitably there'll be some disinvestment as capacity shifts around to different European plants, and I think therefore in 5 years' time, we'll actually have seen some clear damage to the manufacturing sector, and the agricultural sector in particular would be my view and my pointers of the major areas. All of that means consequential damage to some regional economies that can least afford it, and yet I think there's every chance that those diverse, knowledge-driven, service-based, fast growth economies might be barely noticing a difference. But they're a personal view. I'm sure panel members will have different views, and then we'll get into questions from yourselves. So what we'll do is we'll go around now. We'll get some introductions from panel members, and if you can use the question function, then what I'll do is pick up the questions then as we go along. So Steve, you're at the top of my screen anyway. If it's okay, please, you take the floor.
Thanks, Nigel, and welcome everyone to the discussion. Just a brief introduction from myself. I lead the GHD advisory team here in the UK, and we are, I guess, quite a new market entrant into the market here in the UK, although we're a kind of global company. And we specialise very much around sort of infrastructure investment and economics. We do a lot of strategic insight and data-led analytics around economies and around infrastructure. and also get involved in the transactionary side of the business as well. So, we're involved at many stages of projects and the life cycle of infrastructure. And particularly my lens is very much around the link between infrastructure development and projects, development projects, and the wider economic development landscape. So I guess the lens I'd put on this is maybe around, kind of the impact that Brexit may have, particularly in the infrastructure sector, and then I guess the impacts that could also have in terms of the levelling up agenda that we're heading towards. And within that context, I'd just say a few things really. In terms of infrastructure, it's clearly a critical part of the economy. Estimates are putting it about 7% of GDP. The sector employs, upwards of 3 million people. So it's a significant sort of driver and heart to the economy. And, I think the policy direction that has been coming out, certainly over the last sort of 6 to 9 months, and has accelerated through COVID as well, is around the role of infrastructure in the rebuilding of the economy. So not only the recovery, but also the levelling up agenda. So it's very, very important. And at the moment, as a sector, it probably employs about 10% of its employees. Probably about 10% are EU migrants. So the expectation is that Brexit, in one way or another, and we don't know quite how it's going to land, but certainly the view from our side is that we could see some significant impacts, or are likely to see significant impacts across a number of different areas. I think skill shortages, is an ongoing issue within the sector, and based on the large number of migrants, is likely to be exacerbated. So that will impact projects and project delivery. Procurement and sort of costs, if we're looking at weakened pound, possible tariffs, those sorts of things, then we could be seeing higher costs, more lengthy procurement processes. A lot of materials are imported, so there's a kind of knock-on in terms of that supply chain and how it's procured and the cost of that. Over the recent, the recent and the more distant past as well, I guess, the EIB has been a long-term source of finance for infrastructure, particularly around sort of major projects, and that's upwards of sort of £5–6 billion a year. Now that may need to be replaced with other sources, whether that's private. Maybe we see a return, to sort of some PFI models that have been sort of left behind, but in the clamour to replace that source, which may leave us, we're going to have to look at different mechanisms, and certainly setting up a UK infrastructure bank, if you like, is going to take time. And then there's obviously the ongoing uncertainty and disruption. I mean, that's been part of what we've been living with for a while. But from a transaction investment approach or lens, we certainly, we're aware of a lot of investors, a lot of investment waiting to be placed, and they're waiting for things like COVID and certainly Brexit to be resolved one way or the other before some decisions are made. So we're already seeing that investment decisions are being held back. I think the final point I'd make was just linking into something you said, Nigel, around damage to the weakened part or the weaker parts of the economy. I sort of concur with that. I think the regions within the UK that are maybe have a particular economic base and weaker economies, I think are probably more exposed to some of these impacts than others. So there's a range of areas there that could come to play, but as with everyone, we're kind of waiting to see actually where the landscape sets.
Thanks, Steve. Feels like we've been waiting to see for forever, doesn't it? But yeah, interesting points on this whole position and then the government stated position on the levelling up agenda, and the two seem to be sort of at odds, don't they? But Heather, over to you for maybe similarly downbeat assessments, or maybe you've got something to cheer us up with. What do you think?
So, well, hopefully. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Heather Frecklington. I'm a partner of Focus Consultants. We're a multidisciplinary consultancy. We sort of create, deliver and assess projects is our sort of strapline. I head up our economic development section in this, so the create function of our company. And what I'm going to talk about is less of what the potential impacts might be, although we'll have a view on those, but is more around what we're currently doing and what we think is sort of likely to be coming through from sort of our company perspective and the work we're doing with clients in response really to Brexit and what people expect potentially could happen. So as a business, we're working with clients to help develop solutions which might help mitigate the risks and minimise the impact of Brexit, but also to be upbeat slightly, to maximise the opportunities that Brexit might open up to. So we've been working with clients to look at analysis regarding which of the areas are likely to be hardest hit geographically and sector-wise, and to help inform investment decisions and refocusing strategy, and just helping to ensure our client base, which is largely public sector, are best placed to benefit from the opportunities, whether that's funding opportunities that are likely to come about or investment opportunities. Some of our evaluation work that we're doing on projects is helping to sort of refocus projects to tackle Brexit challenges. So one example is around sort of inward investment initiatives and helping people to kind of get that message about the UK is still open for business, and making sure that the broad strategy is right around the skills, the R&D offer, and understanding what investors are looking for. We've been doing some work recently in a particular sector, and what's come out strongly is that skills, access to power, access to digital infrastructure are fundamental, alongside the skills and innovation support that are available, and just that an approach from government that they, let's say, open for business, and that they want businesses out there. So that's not taken away the immense challenges that Brexit's going to present from an inward investment perspective, but it's about what we can do to mitigate those. Other evaluation work we've done is helping to start to reshape some business support, particularly around business confidence to invest. So that it's well known that there's been a sort of cash hoarding ever since the referendum. So it's about developing projects that can potentially bring some funding to help release some business investment and give confidence that it's the right time to make some investment. We've been doing quite a lot of sector-specific initiatives, as many face different challenges in response to Brexit, particularly around logistics and food and drink are areas that we've been looking at. So the work around logistics, for example, is looking at how to support the sector to adapt post-Brexit, which is going to be really difficult because of the cost increases. But it's also, interestingly, a period of really rapid growth due to the pandemic. So some of the statistics that have come out of the logistics work we've done is that there's been 5 years growth in 6 months as a result of the pandemic. So it's an interesting scenario that Brexit is going to be a challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And in terms of the response to the pandemic, and there's also some opportunities because we're increasingly seeing a desire for a bit more within logistics, onshoring to maintain supply chains. So other things we're looking at in relation to sectors is sort of initiatives to boost recruitment, training opportunities, particularly around digitisation, automation to boost productivity and help reduce costs to respond to Brexit. And we're also looking at opportunities for sectors to link into the Freeport proposals. What we're expecting is more sectoral focus activity, because there's clearly going to be some sectors are impacted much worse than others, and I've got some views on that, on what they might be. But in terms of what's been sort of touched upon around levelling up, I do wonder, and I don't know if I think this will happen, but I do wonder whether there'll be a further push for devolution on the basis that clearly different regions are going to have different impacts, and there's going to be a need, particularly in the big cities, for very specific local responses to the issues affecting the local areas, but also recognising that the town's agenda is very important politically. So it will be interesting to see how local areas are given the opportunity to respond to their specific issues around Brexit.
Great. Good. Well, no, that's some great opening thoughts. Well, now Paul, who does indeed work in local government. So, Paul, have you? How do you see this playing out?
Thank you, Nigel, and that's a great segue, I think, from Heather there in terms of moving to devolution. But let me introduce myself. Let me know if you can't hear me, because I think I'm having some Wi-Fi problems. So my name's Paul Frainer. I'm Assistant Director of Strategy and Economy at Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire District Council, and I work within a large shared planning team. My role really is around strategic growth, strategic development, and economic development. So, you know, a bit of a mixed picture, bearing in mind that I've got a city plus, you know, quite a extensive rural hinterlands in terms of economy as well. I mean, interesting to pick up on Heather's point around devolution. I think it's something that will be interesting to see what comes forward from government next year. Really, some of the things that we're really trying to grapple with now are touching a little bit more on the local level or the bottom up level. And I think for a starting point, I don't think you can decouple what's happened this year in terms of COVID from what, you know, could be a real final nail in the coffin for some areas of business when Brexit comes to bear. I mean, we, you know, like others have said, we just have got no, you know, real detail on that. We know what the unknowns are, but we don't know what the knowns are, if you see what I mean. In terms of that economic development bottom up piece, I think we're looking at it in two levels. Obviously, Cambridge has got, you know, quite a knowledge-based economy. It's a very high output area, contributes net contribution to the treasury. But actually, you know, I'm more worried about the sectors that don't get the headlines. I'm worried about SMEs. I'm worried about the supply chains within the area. And I think the macro scale businesses, I think, we have greater resilience, and also, you know, they can make choices whether they stay or whether they go eventually. One of those things that we'll see. But on, you know, on a micro scale, those businesses that we see, certainly within the city centre, that have already been under huge pressures. I mean, you'll know some of the high streets work and some of the town centres work that actually government is focused on, but no doubt there are big problems there already. And actually there are, I think that there is a view that actually we're missing stuff. Things are dropping through the cracks. And I think I agree with Nigel in a way that, you know, there may well be some small bounce backs, but I don't think that we're going to really see the real effects of this until a little bit further down the line, when we start to see some of those supply chain fractures, and right at the granular level too. You know, some of the work that we've been doing as local authorities is really trying to understand the full breadth of our businesses, and those that facilitate all of those big sectors and that big GVA output, but that play a crucial part in enabling that to be there in those locations. And I think that there's obviously, from my perspective, there's some urgent clarity required on shared prosperity. I think that's some definite clarity on that. I mean, we're 3 weeks away, right, from this date, and we still need some clarity around so much of this stuff. So I think that there's a load of shifts that have been accelerated this year from COVID, and they may well actually soften Brexit a little bit in some ways, but also I think some things have slipped under the radar because we're so focused on, you know, the here and now from this year, certainly around, you know, some trends towards remote working and home working, and what that means for those small local economies, but what it means for the labour markets in, you know, big cities and town centres. And, you know, you know, investment in town centres, investment in those areas. It's 80% down, I think, in terms of town centre investment. I've still got only about a fifth of my workforce. Let's call it my workforce. It's not my workforce, of course, but a fifth of the workforce coming into Cambridge, you know, from March. I mean, that's a phenomenal shift in terms of movement, and you know, that has far-reaching effects. And a lot of those businesses and a lot of those smaller economies that will rely on that larger scale, you know, movement are going to be affected by Brexit. Should, you know, some of the things that we know are going to be difficult for them come in, you know, access to supplies, difficulty with, you know, with movement through the ports. I mean, we might see some shifts to different behaviours, whether or not, you know, there's be a shift towards more air carrying, you know, cargoes rather than, you know, by boat and transit, because it's just easier from a paperwork perspective, and we'll just have to wait and see. But I think for a lot of those businesses, you know, they can't cope with they can't cope with anything further. You know, they're barely hanging on from government grants, and I think that, you know, there are some difficult times ahead. Trying not to be all completely negative, you know, there will be some massive opportunities coming from this. You know, we have got an opportunity to shape some of how we want the economy to change. You know, green growth and clean tech is one of the areas that's going to be something that councils and local government as a whole is going to need to be focused on. We've got commitments to both Paris Climate Change Act and the Paris Agreement, and that will be something that, you know, could stimulate growth and innovation in this country. But I do agree that I think we need some real clear view on devolution as well, because I think regionally there are going to be some very different challenges and different issues, and that is best solved at a much more local level.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I can see, well, firstly, more than well over 50 people on the call now, and a couple of questions coming in. So please do now use the question and answer function to pose those questions. But the first one of those, and we have touched on in opening remarks, but it's how do you see inward investment changing, and do you still see Europe being the source of the largest bulk of the largest sort of grand bulk of projects, or is that going to shift too? Heather, I think you mentioned inward investment in particular. So before I go to the others, maybe you've got some initial views on that.
Yeah, I think my gut feel is that I think there will be a shift. I think that we'll see inevitably see less from Europe, and I think there'll be about rebalancing in terms of kind of where that inward investment is coming from. I know that in the last year, the sort of highest amount of investments has come from the USA, for example, as opposed to Europe, and I think part of the challenge is going to be around the sort of the movement of people and the sort of typical investment from European companies that they're going to be concerned about their staff not being able to have that free movement. So I think there'll never be a shift away from some investment from Europe. I think from a strategy perspective, I think we need a really broad strategy around how we develop those relationships with other countries, because I think that's what we need to think about in terms of, it's not just about the investment money that's very nice that comes from foreign direct investment. It's about that long-term relationship that you start to get with countries when you start to get foreign direct investment being made. So there's a lot of relationship building that needs to be done, and I think there's an element of where are those historical connections with different regions that they can continue to be built on. And as I think I said in the opening remarks, it's about developing that competitive advantage. People come, yes, they come to for the market that we're not going to be part of, we assume, soon, but they also come for the talent, they come for the HEI infrastructure, they come for the tax incentives for research and development, etc. They come for the training and education offer. So I think a broad strategy, a slightly different approach. A lot of places do a broad strategy, but I think we need to ensure that that broad strategy is in place for different regions and towns and cities, to ensure that the entire offer there is there, that it's not just about the availability of land or the availability of incentives in the market. There's other things that can draw people in, but I think there will inevitably be more of a shift away from European investment, is my gut feel. So.
Sure. Well, no, gut feels all we've got at the moment in some cases. Absolutely. That's true. And I mean, Steve, same question to you, but also maybe just reflecting. I suppose I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about tariffs and the changing regulatory environment. But it's interesting. I think both you and Heather have picked up on the skills issue around some of this investment too. So how you see that playing out fully. So.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes under the radar a little bit. I think skills in respect of, it's a constant struggle. I think in a number of sectors to have the right skills, the right sort of people, and clearly the current relationship with Europe, or the old relationship with Europe as it would become, has really kind of helped that. I think the skills shortage, skills gaps in a long way. So with that changing, I think there will be pressures. If I think about it from our business specifically, we, as I said, we're an Australian company. We work globally, so we move people around the world quite a lot. I don't think in our line of business we will necessarily experience any problems. We're used to mobility. There will be more complications, I guess, or more steps that we need to go through to hire people from Europe. But I don't think, being in the UK, we will be less attractive to European talent who are looking to come to work here. Just as there'll be more onus on the business, I guess, to maybe some more cost to attract that talent. But certainly from a sectoral point of view, where it's much more labour intensive, and I mentioned that the construction infrastructure sectors, they have been very reliant on European workforce, and again, that reliance grew up through the kind of EU mechanisms. To replace that with labour from other parts of the world, I think there are mechanisms and there are costs and there's bureaucracy in place there. So it will, I think it will play out over time. But I think a bit like what Heather was saying on the investment side, there is a sort of bit of a structural shift. We'll probably see less interest in certain centres of coming across to the UK. It's harder for people to come across to the UK, potentially, depending on what deal's done. And therefore, we will still need the same level of employment. If we're going to achieve the sort of growth and the levelling up agenda that's put out there, we're going to still need the same number of people and the same sort of skills. We've sort of partially turned off a European tap, and it's how we can turn on taps from elsewhere in the world. I think is going to determine the balance and where we actually end up.
Do you think, Steve, you're an Australian company yourselves, and some discussion perhaps about more investment from other English-speaking countries, not necessarily replacing European investment, but just more of that discussion going on? Do you see that from conversations with your Australian colleagues?
Well, I think maybe it's a bit of a loaded response here, that a lot of our colleagues in Australia are very keen to come and work in the UK. I think some of our UK colleagues are quite keen to go down there as well, to be frank. So I think there's an ongoing sort of fluidity there, if you like, in terms of skills and talent that is not just not our company, a lot of other companies, and there's a lot of movement both at student level and working level between the two countries. I think other locations will have to play a part in kind of providing the skills that we're going to need. Now, maybe one argument could be that now it's just as or potentially it's more as bureaucratic for people from the European Union to get a visa and work here as it is for an Australian or from other parts of the world. Then that's leveled up. So everyone's competing at the same level. But I think at a practical level, it puts our European colleagues and talent, into the same sort of environment that everyone else is in at the moment, and there's more hurdles and more bureaucracy to get through before they can actually start. I think just touching on the inward investment, again, I agree with what Heather was saying, but I think from an investment funds point of view, I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree that European-based investment funds, whether we will see any significant change there. I think foreign direct investment, setting up companies here, etc., is different from the investment flows. And certainly, I was on a conference 2 weeks ago, the European Infrastructure Finance Conference, and we've very much picked up the view that there's a lot of funds out there at the moment that are looking to be placed. There's more money than places to invest at the moment was the sort of general consensus. And the feeling that was picked up was very much around, once some of this uncertainty starts drifting away, that we could see, increasing in number of deals and the level of investment coming in. And that, I guess, around COVID and Brexit, that surprised me a bit. There was, still quite a lot of optimism in the sort of finance markets around the opportunities to invest. So, we may see less foreign direct investment, but the investment flows behind projects, behind companies, there still seems to be a lot of optimism, not necessarily a negative impact there. It's just been held back at the moment, seems to be the view that I was picking up.
Sure. No, well, thanks. And similarly, in terms of this kind of wall of money idea, some of the businesses we've looked at around things like clean tech, and then moving into then EVs and what have you, just an appetite to invest in new ideas and new innovation, as well as the infrastructure that you were mentioning. So. Yeah,
and I think the recent raft of sort of policy direction, of the headlines around sort of greening up and the Build Back Better, etc. I think some of the direction being promoted there is very, very exciting. It's innovative, and it does place us in a good position in terms of the UK to grab some of those agendas and to lead those agendas. And if we do that, then I think investment and opportunity will come out of it. So, but again, I guess the proof will be in the pudding. Policy papers and words are great, but actually translating that, a bit like levelling up. If levelling up can be achieved, and the right detail is put behind it, then that's wonderful. But it's seeing that proof in the pudding, I think, as well, is important. Thanks, Steve. Paul, I was going to. There's different questions come in. I mean, feel free to if you've got anything to add to the investment question, of course. But think one that's quite relevant to you is a question that says that essentially businesses just haven't had the space to engage with Brexit this year with COVID and all the rest of it. Some of the things you were actually saying. Is there anything else we can do that we haven't been doing? Is there anything left to do that we could do to help some of the businesses that are already in our patches as well? So if you can take that one, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I think one comment just into the last conversation around inward investment. I think that we've got some great stuff here that could be promoted. I think we need to do a much better job centrally of promoting what it is that we're looking for inward investment for. I mean, if you look at some of the European promotions from the German government, etc., they've really nailed what it is that they're looking for. And I think that we've got, especially in my area, I've got, big part of my world is the Oxford to Cambridge arc as an area, and I think that that's got a massive opportunity from an inward investment perspective. Just needs some promotion around it, and so I do think that there are some opportunities there that I think that we've got to essentially get our house in order first while we're waiting for that uncertainty to slightly dissipate, as Steve said, because if we're there in the picture afterwards, then that makes it a much easier transition. But yeah, I think in terms of the question regarding economic development in supporting small businesses, I think that there's a lot we can do from a local government perspective and even from a public sector perspective. I think that we're massive buyers. We have huge amounts of procurement under our threshold. And no doubt there's going to be, local government and the public sector in itself will have some problems. There's going to be some problems there, but they will still need to be commissioning and buying in work. And to be able to focus that on local businesses and take them through the process and tweak our systems. I know we're doing some work on it at the moment to try and understand how we can really incentivize local organizations and local businesses to be able to feel like they've got something to engage with us as a public sector and give them some security about. In terms of preparedness, I mean, I think our business is unprepared. They're as unprepared as everyone else because we just absolutely don't know what that might mean for them. There is, some certain sectors will be much more resilient than others. We already know that a number of sectors have got, real big problems in terms of hospitality. Retail definitely, but some of those sectors won't see those issues. So it's being a little bit more specific and maybe getting under the bonnet of individual businesses. But you're saying that have we got the resources there to be out and go and do that granular work? Potentially some areas might have, but some areas just won't have the resource to be able to go out and do that. I think that actually understanding that businesses and the labour market in those areas shapes economies, and that could, we should be not trying to be overly, regulatory. We should be being more facilitatory, if you can say that, and trying to let some of that bottom up stuff happen. And I do worry in a sense around some of the other areas of my work, which is planning, and how fit for purpose that is in terms of being able to facilitate some of the innovation that will, most definitely come out of recession around some of those businesses, and be able to let that grow in a natural way. So I think it's something we do need to be alive to.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. One of the things that struck me around this, are we ready? Is there will be some businesses who don't do any exporting or don't think they do, or even importing. Firstly, if they don't do any exporting at all and they thought, well, we don't need to worry about Brexit, to what extent do they realise that maybe they're in a product area where a tariff cap's about to be completely removed, and they're going to wake up on the sort of 1st of January and competitors are bringing in things that are cheaper and they kind of didn't see it coming. I do think there's a potential issue there as well, but there's a limit to what we can do as economic development professionals to get people ready for that, I guess. There's an interesting. I actually was slightly appalled at this this news myself. So one of our members has said that are the panel suffering from some optimism bias, and then cites the example of Jim Radcliffe, who actually set about doing Project Grenadier, which was he was wanting to make sure that there was an equivalent to a Land Rover 4x4 when he thought that the UK wasn't going to be building the next Land Rover, which it then did, who's put his plant in France. So yeah, I did think there was some absolute implications for that, for sure. But the panel does seem to be, the audience does seem to have been exercised and picked up on the skills agenda. And this business around, well, clearly there's been a massive shift in the workforce in the last few months. What do panel members think about the implications for developing the internal workforce, many of which may now have lost their chosen career, and then in addition to that, you know, this ability to maintain diversity in terms of the recruitment. So yeah, sort of pick those two questions up together if I can. And Heather, you know, have you got any thoughts around this this perennially tricky thing of enabling people to move between careers?
Yeah, I wish I did, but I've got some views. So so some of the work that we've been doing in a particular sector has been really quite interesting around how to build the workforce for that sector locally, and that has been looking at a very broad approach from engaging young people in fun activities, to understand the opportunities that this particular sector that we've been working with, to understand the opportunities that exist, and that it's perhaps not what they perceived it to be, which I know is not necessarily a new approach, but that combined with the need for that enterprise mindset, and that I don't necessarily mean enterprise from a starting your own business, but preparing people for work, and that not in a particularly sort of soft way, but in potentially quite a hard way around. I think there's a bit of a perception that there's jobs and that you can train people and then automatically they can go into those jobs, but I think there's that softer side around getting people ready and in the right mindset for those jobs, and then making sure that training provision's in place from all the way from FE through to HE level 2 to level 7 potentially. And we've developed a couple of projects where that broad range of provisions been on site. And I think what's really important is about that industry engagement in those. So it's not purely FE and HE providers and schools coming in and delivering. It's about the industry genuinely saying what they need and guiding that. I know that this doesn't offend someone. I know that some of the conversations I've had with some businesses, and a piece of work we've done recently is that universities are perhaps in certain areas, the quote was 2 years behind where industry is in terms of some of the skills around digital and automation. And unless there's intervention from industry work and the sector and the education sector genuinely working together, I don't think that's going to be addressed. So I think those are kind of key things about ensuring that the local population is in a position to benefit from the jobs that are coming.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's sort of self-evident, isn't it? If the people at the cutting edge of digital are finding it tricky to get skills and are paying top dollar, how on earth does the education sector grab those people? Mm. I think I'll ask Steve the same question in just a moment, but I think we've got a poll that we can put up around the sectors where people on the call can decide where they think the impact may be greatest over the medium term. So that may come up shortly while we're thinking about that and preparing that. There it is. We'll give you a few seconds to answer that and submit your response, and then we'll go to Steve. So just one. I voted for it myself already. I don't know if I'm allowed to vote, but I did do so. Steve, what do you see? I mean, you look particularly. You've mentioned already the infrastructure sector and clearly the opportunities for training. How easy actually is it to get people to change careers and to train them appropriately? Is it almost impossible, or actually is it a great opportunity? What do you think?
I could probably sit on the fence halfway between the two. I do think. So I was distracted there by the polls.
By the answer. Yeah.
I think it's not impossible, you know, and within our workforce, we have examples of people that have sort of switched track and sort of pivoted at key points in their career. But I do think, you know, in terms of training and you know, that provision to help the transition from one sort of work stream to another, you know, it's an ongoing problem. It's always a problem. I think what we're noticing now in our business, you know, we're moving much more towards sort of digital and data-led approaches, and I think, you know, even within a you know, multidisciplinary company, you know, we have been traditionally engineering focused, and we've moved much more towards professional services, and now, you know, towards data and digital. That you know, you can see that the difficulty and the I guess in some ways the hardship that people within the organization go through as the organization transitions. So, you know, if I think about that and then apply that to an individual level, you know, it's not impossible to transition, but it is very, you know, it's a challenge, it's hard work. And you know, people have to be sort of committed to it. It's not something, I don't think, that you can you know, sort of pivot into a new kind of work stream, new area, without that full commitment to doing so. I think you could be found out very, very quickly. I just wanted to touch on to pivot myself here a little bit, because I'm intrigued by Chris's comment around working from home. And how sustainable long term. Again, we've been looking at that ourselves and doing some research internally, but also with clients. And in fact, Paul and I were sort of touching upon this when we had a chat yesterday. In that I do think working from home is one of the big trends, if you like, that has been accelerated through COVID. So it's moving off Brexit, I guess, towards COVID a bit. But it's clearly broken down barriers. People previously who were wedded to their desks have now been shown that they can be productive at home. The trust between sort of managers and staff to be able to work remotely where that wasn't already in place, you know, those barriers have been broken down. So I don't, you know, we're not going to return to, I don't think, the working patterns that we had in this time last year. I think the dial has been reset. If we're at 10 o'clock, it's now reset at 3 o'clock. Where we end up, I think no one really knows. But certainly what we found, to answer Chris's question, is that our staff, and you know, we've got engineers all the way through to data scientists and people that are in and out of the office, and people that have sort of stuck to the office 5 days a week, you know, just at their desks. I think the latest poll we did, which was, I think, a month or two ago, so it's, you know, we've been through COVID for a long while now, we seem to be settling with around 2/3 of our staff wanting much more of a balanced work from home, work in the office relationship. People don't want to go back, you know, most people don't want to go back 5 days a week to that commute and that sitting at their desk. But they do miss the social interaction, they do miss the mentoring, etc., and are getting a bit fed up with just working from home. So people are fed up, but I don't think we'll go back to where we were. And I think there's big implications there for local economies, in terms of city centres, in terms of, you know, land use offices, etc., and also, I guess, in terms of the you know, infrastructure provision and nature of housing, that the people that are, you know, are wanting to go back to the office and already back in the office as much as they can are people where they don't necessarily have the space or the conditions at home to be able to work effectively. But I think it's a big shift in our society that's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out.
And it's actually fascinating if you then place a Brexit lens on that and think, well, actually, your employees, and you could set up some sort of legal structure to accommodate this, but your employees could still be in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, and we had, we had examples of that with some of our international staff that, because of the situation, needed to go home or wanted to go back to their home country, but they continued working 5 days a week. And in fact, a couple of times it surprised me that their Wi-Fi infrastructure was much better than central London. So there's pros and cons of both ways. Apart from I was sitting here in Cambridge and it was pretty dull, and they were had beautiful sunshine outside. So.
I don't know whether everybody on the call could see the response to the survey. So just for and it plays into exactly what we've just been talking about, is that people thought that Brexit was going to massively impact on manufacturing, next followed by agriculture. As you can see, as I think you can see there, so 65% manufacturing, 24% agriculture. I'm not sure if just the panel can see that or not. But anyway, what it does say is that everything we've just been talking about around having staff remotely, etc. Of course, agriculture and manufacturing, impossible. Services and what we've just talked about, perfectly doable. So yeah, it's really, it makes you wonder whether there's a real twin track approach to the economy from now on. So there's a question on there, which is almost the question about, did you think Brexit was a good idea? But it's been rephrased. So it says, what's the weighting between the level of benefit of long-term versus short-term impacts of Brexit? Will we see more benefits in the long term than the short term? And I think that almost gets to the heart of the question we'll ask. And in fact, we had a question prepared. So in the medium term, how optimistic are you? And we'll be able to see this coming up. One thing I would just throw in before we go around the panel and get views, and rather than give my own views, I'll mention the Bank of England's forecast just before we agreed the transition period last year, where they had a number of scenarios, but they expected a no-deal scenario, but with a transition period. They forecast that would knock 7% off the UK economy. So if that's, it was a permanent loss as well. It wasn't just a drop and then it recovers. So that was the Bank of England's view. I have to say, whilst I don't know what the percentage would be, I'm not particularly optimistic myself into the long term, but into the very long term, who knows? Because there's all sorts of other moving parts beyond just one issue. Yeah, again, I don't know if you can see that, but most people on this call are either not at all optimistic or not very. The two of those combined hit 62%. So nearly 2/3. And in fact, there is nobody on this call this afternoon who is very optimistic about the longer term perspective. But Heather, in terms of this kind of, are we worrying rightly about the short term, but actually you see all sorts of sunny uplands in whatever economists call the long term?
No, I think I would probably agree with the Bank of England and what you were suggesting. I think it's very difficult to say in terms of long term. I think there's huge short term and medium term implications. Long term, I've not seen any evidence that persuades me that there's going to be a significant positive long term impact. I think from the perspective of kind of the work that we do, I think the whole levelling up agenda is kind of been obliterated in some respects by Brexit. I think that the impact's going to be felt more significantly, and so there's going to need to be even more work. I think there's going to be more differences between the north and south, to be taking it very broadly. But if we look at the levelling up agenda, and I think it's going to take even longer to achieve, if we ever achieve that levelling up agenda. And I think Brexit's had a very long-term negative impact on that. So that's not particularly optimistic, I'm afraid. I think there are interesting opportunities out there, but I think long-term, I think overall, it's negative from my perspective. So.
You know what the answer is, Heather? It's just that when we talk about long term as economists, we're just not thinking long term enough. I mean, the Romans were only in the UK for 400 years. It's maybe we just need to take a really long term perspective.
Yeah, maybe in 400 years it'll be fine. So yeah.
Yeah. Steve, what about you? How do you see this?
I don't know what more to add, really. I share very much sort of Heather's view, but I remain the eternal optimist. I think you know, if COVID has taught us anything, is that you know, we've got to be quick to change and adapt, and so I think, you know, while I'm not superly optimistic, you know, if we change some of our thinking, some of our approaches, then I become a bit more optimistic. You know, I think, you know, there are opportunities out there, undoubtedly. Are we at the moment set up to really exploit and take them? I'm not sure. Is Brexit an impact we need right now? I don't think so. You know, it's piling on more uncertainty, even, you know, even once the deal's done. It's a shock, and you know, at the moment there's enough shocks coming through the macroeconomies and geopolitics. It's one, personally, I think we could do without, but there will be opportunities, and we've got to, I guess, from a rational expectations point of view, the more optimistic we are, then the more chance we've got of having a better outcome.
Yeah, and I without disagreeing with what I've already said, I think I take that, Steve. I think that that actually maybe it's the media, but I do think there's been, at the beginning of COVID, I found myself sort of trapped in some headlines, in some sort of hysteria that this is going to be absolutely economically appalling. Well, of course, it's been an absolute personal disaster for many, but the economy has sort of limped on, and some sectors have barely noticed it at all. So I think we cry catastrophe, maybe slightly too often, but yeah, not great news. Well, Paul, you're sat in some ways with influence over one of the areas of the UK where, with the knowledge-driven activities and a lot of service sector stuff too, that maybe you could have more cause to optimism than most. And given that, it's probably appropriate, with 3 minutes to go, that we give you sort of the last word on this and see what you think will pan out.
I'm eternally optimistic, Nigel. It's going to be absolutely fine. I think one of the things I would say is that I think this is going to have an incredibly long tail. So to take any view at this particular time, I'm glad that you guys are confident in answering the question about the long-term, short-term benefits of Brexit. Part of my job is crystal ball looking a lot of the time anyway. I'm planning for housing growth that won't be built until 2045, and I think that that's a challenge in itself. I think that it is a sector issue. I think some sectors will absolutely be fine. I don't think that there'll be any issues with them, but they also rely on other parts of the economy. So as we start to see those changes, I'd be very interested to see how that affects some of those key knowledge intensive industries, the life sciences, the tech in my area that, you know, that are obviously really contributing from an economic perspective. I do think that you know, all joking aside, I'm not overly optimistic. I'm less optimistic about the combination of the last year with Brexit on top than I would have been a year ago, just simply because I feel like we've become less prepared. I don't know whether that's even possible, because it's just not, you know, it doesn't seem any certainty around it at all. But because of what's happened in the last year, we haven't maybe been keeping our eye on it quite so closely. Although I would say that actually, if you could distill some of the behaviour change that we've seen that's been positive over the last 10 months and use that as a model for how we want the economy to look in 5-10 years' time, then I think that there's some quite compelling optimism there, and that will be irrespective of Brexit and COVID. It will be human behaviours You know, we've seen things change that would not necessarily change for years. Habits, cultural behaviours that don't, you know, that aren't easy to change. And in some respects as well, we've been given a bit of a crystal ball, because what we've done is we've accelerated ourselves forward 10 years. Now, the worst thing that we could possibly do is try and retrofit a previous world onto how we recover. So I think, you know, let's keep what we felt worked, but not try and retrofit back into that. And I think really understanding, I think there's a fundamental difference between how we look at growth going forward and understand what economic growth means for people and what effect it has on all of the challenges that we currently face, from both a social piece and an environmental piece, and what economic development offers into that space in terms of being inclusive and actually, you know, moving that to a more shared model of how we grow. So I think that two sides of it, isn't there? You know, we are, you know, it's all down to humans, and we are very illogical at the best of times. So to be able to predict what we might do in the face of this stuff is going to be critical. But, you know, I think that we got to work. We've got some great skills. And, you know, I think the skills, I could talk about skills and talk about some of the stuff that you were talking about previously, certainly around the home working and those areas that, you know, you could talk about all day in terms of what might happen. But, you know, we have to start with where we currently at, and we do have a much better feel for what live data is telling us, and we do have the ability to be able to flex a little bit more quickly and agilely with that, and at least make decisions and then be able to reiterate them rather than nail our colours to the mast and in 10 years time be, you know, delivering something that was, you know, for 2010 or for 1990. So I think that there's, you know, there's hope. And, you know, I think it's, you know, it's a good thing. Yeah,
hope is well, hope is where we leave it. It's we're out of time, but I think there's been various things said on this call this afternoon that are themes for another day. So that's quite interesting too. Certainly, I'd like to thank IED corporate members, Heather Frecklington from Focus Consultants and Steve Scott from GHD Advisory. Paul, my fellow board member, thank you very much. But also, of course, thank all of you for attending the webinar. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and we look forward to seeing you on another one in the near future. We'll be putting out a number of future topics for the new year very soon. So thank you for joining us. Season's wishes to you all, and thanks again to our panelists. So,
thanks, Nigel.
thank you. Bye.